Blake felt an unsettling weight in the air as spring crept in. It wasn't the fresh beauty of the season that stirred him, but something darker, something malevolent that gnawed at the edges of his mind. For months, he'd been trying to write a novel, something about a cult, a lingering witchcraft buried deep within the forgotten corners of Maine. But the words kept slipping away, as if the story itself was cursed. Instead, he spent hours staring out of his apartment window, his gaze fixed on the distant hill. The old church spire loomed there, black against the sky, but it was not a place of comfort. The birds avoided it. Its silhouette always felt wrong, like an uninvited shadow creeping closer. When Blake focused on it too long, the world around him would start to blur and twist, warping into something unrecognizable. As spring edged toward late April, the nights grew colder, and the fog became thicker, almost suffocating. It felt as though the very air itself was pressing down on Blake, and soon the restlessness turned into an urgent need, a compulsion he couldn't ignore. Walpurgisnacht was fast approaching, the time when the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest. Blake couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him, something that had been calling to him from the depths of the hill. His obsession had grown into a desperate hunger. The time had come. He had to see the church for himself, to step into the place that had haunted him like a waking nightmare. Blake stepped deeper into the sprawling city, its cold, decaying streets stretching endlessly before him. Buildings that had once been grand now stood broken, their windows shattered, their walls streaked with grime and rot. The air was thick with a sense of decay, the smell of wet stone and something else, a rancid metallic scent that made Blake's stomach turn. He wandered through narrow, winding streets, passing old shops with broken windows and dirty neon signs that blinked erratically, casting fleeting flashes of light across the wet, cracked pavement. There was a constant sense that the city was alive, breathing, watching him from every shadow. The street signs were foreign, as though the city had forgotten itself, slipping into some other dimension where nothing made sense. The people. Their faces were dark, their eyes hollow. They moved like shadows, drifting through the streets with no sense of direction, no purpose. Blake felt their gazes on him, cold and predatory, as though they were watching a meal. When he approached a shopkeeper to ask about the stone church, the man's reaction made Blake's blood run cold. The smile that curled across his lips was too wide, too knowing. His eyes were glassy, vacant. For a moment, Blake felt a shiver run down his spine. The shopkeeper's voice was too calm, as if trying to hide a deeper, darker terror. He denied knowing anything, but his hands trembled as he turned away, leaving Blake with the distinct impression that this was not ignorance, but something far worse. Fear. A fear Blake could almost taste in the air. Blake pressed on, though his heart raced faster with every step. The streets twisted like veins through a dying corpse, leading him deeper into the decaying heart of the city. The fog was so thick now, it felt as if it were wrapping around him, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into some unseen nightmare. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being led, guided by unseen hands, deeper into this urban labyrinth. The alleys stretched on forever, their shadows clinging to him like a second skin, and every turn brought him to another dead end, another passage that seemed to lead nowhere but into darkness. And then, there it was, a glimpse of the tower, barely visible through the suffocating fog. Blake's breath caught in his throat. The sight of it seemed to pull him forward, his feet moving faster, heart pounding in his chest. But as he approached, the world around him shifted. The sounds of the city disappeared, replaced by a deep, unnatural silence. A passerby walked by him, but when Blake asked about the church, the man's reaction made his blood run cold. His fear was so palpable, so overwhelming that Blake could almost taste it. The man traced a strange, protective symbol in the air, muttering something under his breath, a warning, a curse. Blake could feel the temperature drop, the air thickening with an ominous weight as the dark shapes in the fog stirred. Then, as Blake stumbled through the dark alleys, a sudden jolt of recognition pierced through the fog that had wrapped itself around him. A black spire rose from the swirling mist, cutting sharply against the gray sky just above the jagged rows of brown rooftops. The twisted geometry of the city felt like a maze now. But there, just ahead, was the thing that had been haunting him, calling to him from the edge of his thoughts. Blake's pulse quickened. His legs moved of their own accord, carrying him through the squalid, unpaved lanes, the stink of wet earth and rot filling his nostrils. He pushed through crowds of grim-faced patriarchs and idle housewives, their hollow eyes watching him. But they said nothing. The children playing in the filthy streets, mud caking their bare feet, stared after him as if he were an intruder, but they too remained silent. No one spoke. No one offered help. Blake pressed forward, the air thickening with each step, as though the city itself was closing in around him. Twice he lost his way, the twisted labyrinth of streets seeming to shift and change, always leading him deeper into unfamiliar territory. He dared not ask for directions. The people here, silent, cold, were not to be trusted. Their faces held secrets too old and too terrible to be revealed. His heart raced as he plunged deeper into the maze of alleys, his every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But something pushed him forward, an insatiable drive to reach that dark tower, to see it with his own eyes. And finally there it was, a shadowed bulk rising up at the end of a narrow alley. The tower was so close now, so near, he could almost feel its cold stone touch his skin. At last, he arrived in a wind-swept open square, its cobblestones slick with damp and age. A heavy stone wall rose on the far side, its jagged surface cracked and weather-worn. Blake stood there, panting, his chest tight as if the very air was pressing down on him. His gaze lifted to the plateau before him, an isolated plateau, elevated and separated from the surrounding streets, covered in creeping weeds and wild grass. A single gate, rusted and padlocked, stood at the top of a short flight of steps. The path from the gate to the church was completely overgrown, as though nature itself had begun to reclaim the place. Blake's pulse quickened as he crossed into this forgotten world, the oppressive atmosphere thickening with each step. Blake stepped cautiously onto the plateau, his feet crunching on the brittle grass. The church loomed before him, an imposing decaying edifice of stone and shadow. The air was rank with the smell of mildew and rot. Some of the high stone buttresses had fallen, their jagged remnants half buried in the wild grass. The windows, Gothic, sooty things, were mostly intact, but many of the stone mullions had been torn away, leaving jagged, empty openings that seemed to stare back at Blake like hollow eyes. He wondered how any of the fragile, faded, stained glass windows had survived this long, given the vandalism and the history of neglected, forgotten places like this. He shuddered. The doors were still there, massive and solid, though tightly shut. There was something wrong about this place, something beyond simple decay. He felt it creeping beneath his skin. Around the top of the plateau, a rusty iron fence circled the grounds, its gates sealed shut with a thick, rusted padlock. There were no sounds here, not even the wind. Blake stood motionless, his body shivering despite the chill in the air. The silence was oppressive, almost unnatural. The once proud church now felt like a tomb, a place where the dead whispered in the dark corners, a place that had been abandoned not just by time, but by everything that once kept it alive. He could feel it, the weight of something ancient and forgotten, watching him from the dark eaves and ivy-covered walls. No birds perched here, no creatures scurried in the overgrowth. Just the sense of something lingering, something far worse than mere neglect. Blake felt the unease swell inside him, his breath quickening as a strange, unnameable dread wrapped itself around his chest. In the birdless eaves, in the black, ivyless walls, something stirred. It was a presence, ancient and insidious. He could almost hear it breathing just beyond his hearing. The faintest rasping sound. He turned away from the church, his heart pounding. But when he glanced back over his shoulder, there was a figure standing in the shadows, watching him. It was just a silhouette, a dark shape, but Blake knew it was there, waiting for him to make the next move. The moment his eyes locked onto it, the figure vanished, swallowed by the fog, leaving only the deepening silence.